Welcome back. We're taking a look at the recent BRICS Summit. Joining us now for more on the BRICS Summit is Monica Arruda. She teaches at the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. And via Skype from London, Io Johnson is the founder and director of Viewpoint Africa. Thanks both for joining us. Monica, let's start with you. Brazil, key member of BRICS, but has been going through a tough time economically, one of the worst recessions in the nation's history. How's that affected the BRICS and Brazil's participation in it?
You know, it's a matter of Temer, the new president, reassuring himself, showing himself as the new leader of the country, right? Because he had a very disputed impeachment process, and there are a lot of people in the country that still challenges his presidency. And I think for him, for his government, it was a show of credibility, a show that he's there meaning business, and that he's there to stay, at least to finish Dilma's presidential term.
But there's lots of economic differences between the two, correct?
Yeah, you know, and fortunately so, because the way that the 6 years in which Dilma stayed in power, you saw a tremendous retrocess in terms of economic performance. All the good accomplishments that you actually had during the Lula administration, which is the PT government, they were being deteriorating during his administration, and she didn't really seem to have acknowledged that was a problem with her government and not something else that was global, as they were claiming that to be.
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about that, and 2008, of course, saw the global crisis, and BRICS has really been an institution that's had to weather that more than some. Io, let's go to you. South Africa, the only African nation in the BRICS grouping. It too's had a few economic woes, especially with threats from the credit agencies and stuff like that. Is the BRICS grouping okay for a downturn as well as when there's rapid growth?
You must take the good with the poor and the rough with the smooth. I'm afraid South Africa has gone through a very, very troubling time in the past few years. The economy has slowed down. Besides, it's been growing slowly, but it's going through a difficult time. Fiscal policy is not working too well. Zuma facing a lot of problems politically. The accusation of corruption still surrounds some of those concerns by the populace, and of course we only saw recently many people are saying that South Africa is still a huge magnet for jobs around Africa itself, and they are clearly a huge draw representing Africa on this massive stage, but not to say that South Africa clearly has many issues, but ultimately I think it's looking at the bigger picture, how it can generate more jobs for its populace, how it can maintain that fiscal policies are at their best, and ultimately how we can continue to grow the economy. Growth is clearly paramount for Zuma right now.
Just staying with you, how does South Africa's involvement in BRICS affect the continent of Africa as a whole? Is there an engine of development through South Africa's membership?
Well, there is always going to be an engine. In fact, they've just signed a huge billion-dollar agreement with China on the automotive industry. But I think key for South Africa right now, it's how does it create jobs? How does it move forward in terms of policy? But ultimately, how does it carry the rest of Africa with it? Because it's true, when South Africa sneezes, the rest of Africa catches a cold. So what happens to South Africa trickles down throughout the entire continent. But yes, South Africa needs to be able to do a lot of bilateral agreements, which it's currently doing with other BRIC members, but ultimately it's about trade.
Monica, I want to go back to you. South Africa suffered from a slowdown in commodity prices, Brazil too as well. There's even been some suggestions that Brazil and South Africa don't really belong to this BRICS grouping. It should be more like RICS, Russia, India and China, or IC, India and China. What's your response to that?
I mean, I don't agree with that clearly, right? Because if you look at despite of all problems that Brazil has, its GDP is pretty big, like over 2 trillion, almost $2 trillion. So it's not insignificant, and it just, you know, Brazil is going through a bad phase, And the nice thing about this government and nice thing about the economies, the mainstream economies in Brazil, is that they know how to get out of this mess, right? In the past, when I was still living in Brazil, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you have that level of financial crisis and the mismanagement of the state machine, people didn't know how to deal with inflation, right? So now there's a consensus. They know exactly what to do. Well, and it's just a matter of time that they're going to put things on track.
Well, my follow-up to that would be, what can the other BRICS members do to help the Brazilian recovery?
You know, I don't think that they really can do much, right? It's just more a self-created problem that Brazil finds himself, and now they need to get them out of this mess, right? I mean, it's good that they have this forum for exchange of ideas, of promoting trade within among themselves. So it's always helpful to have that Brazil diverges itself a little bit from Mercosur and moves and try to look for other partners. So that in that respect is helpful. But you know, I think it's up to Brazilian people and the Brazilian government to find to get out of the well, the deeper well that they are now.
In terms of this grouping, it was first coined by an economist, Jim O'Neill, and it does seem, when you look at it geographically, very dispersed. But there are values in terms of the global south and wanting to have a different international economic architecture. Do you see that being achieved in this time of economic uncertainty, especially when it comes to South Africa and the rest of the continent?
Well, that's just the word, uncertainty. The global slowdown doesn't help. Uncertainty with economies worldwide, which South Africa would need to trade with, including all the BRIC nations. That's a major problem. But I think what's key here is the new development bank, which has been set up by the group. And of course, in its ability to be able to lend and trade freely and easily. That would help significantly. And also the fact that they're willing to set up a new mechanism for its own ratings, moving away from the traditional ratings which have affected South Africa in terms of its fiscal policy, but coming up with a new set of rules of setting up that would apply specifically to BRIC countries. I think that would help them significantly, especially in the bond market. So I think South Africa is gearing up for the long term. It understands the challenges facing the world today in terms of a slowdown. It knows it needs to be able to trade and build up on that trade with Africa and the rest of the world, but more so among its fellow BRIC countries of Brazil, India, China, and Russia. But ultimately, I think South Africa is clearly keen to be able to work closely with all those individuals to be able to make sure it works.
I'm glad you mentioned the credit rating agency, because this is really key for a lot of developing countries, especially South Africa. A little bit of a history. South Africa has had some real problems with the big US credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, Moody's. There's been a lot of domestic press about how they're unfair to developing countries. Do you think a credit rating agency based amongst the BRICS countries could do better? And also, will it be recognized by the global financial system that recognizes these big three American institutions?
Well, why not? Because they're a massive block onto their own. And if they're coming with a new agency, which would say, well, fair enough, our debt, because every country's got debts, and of course the BRIC nations have their debts. If those debts can now be made available in the bond market for other people to buy that debt and then recycle that back in, then that's a huge opportunity, because some of these other agencies haven't really, they've downgraded the South African economy, which hasn't helped. It's affected confidence with investors. And I think if South Africa, Brazil, India, China, and Russia can come up with their own and say, well, even if others don't buy into our stake, even if others don't relate to what we're doing, even if they don't have the confidence, we're saying we've got a rating which says otherwise.
Monica, last word on, I'd like you to pick up on the ratings agency, but also the new development bank, because of course that's big on infrastructure loans, along with other institutions, which of course Brazil has utilized in the past.
Yeah, first on the credit ratings, I think that more competition is always good, because you have a lot of power on these three major agencies. Yeah, exactly. But just you have three agencies that really, and they have had their problems in the past, not only assessing countries, but assessing companies as well.
The housing crisis here,
Enron is one case, But I'm a bit skeptical about having one credit rating agency being created by these countries. I would prefer to be a more neutral party. Because in the end, investors are going to be concerned about saving their money, securing their money, and they want to have returns on their money, and so they can come up with any credit agencies they want. But if they're not credible, right, you're not going to have investors are not going to use it.
Point taken on the new development bank and infrastructure loans between.
I think it can be helpful, especially for South Africa. But I know that China is investing. Aside from the development bank, they have their own investment policy, and in Latin America and Brazil has benefited a lot. And in the last wave of investments they have made in Latin America, the focus has shifted a lot to building infrastructure. But I can see I think the bank can be very helpful because they have so many projects on environmental policies and agribusiness, and I think that would be a good medium through which channelize all that money that they have. It's a wealthy group, right? So they don't need to go use another banks, IMF or the World Bank, for that matter, if they can have greater control of their investment.
So BRICS continue to move forward despite the economic headwinds it's facing. Monica Arruda, thank you so much here in our Washington, D.C. studio. And Io Johnson in London, thanks very much for a very stimulating discussion.